I've been doing Bible study for years. I was a Sunday school teacher, and now I've been preaching for you it'll be 10 years in June. And it's hard to study the Bible because it's written by so many people. And it's written over thousands of years. How could it ever be expected to hang together? It's a big old jumble of stuff. But it's really like this. Picture from Glendalough. Maybe some of you recognize it. The place, anyway. As a photographer and as a landscape painter, I know that even the most confusing landscape is really composed of shapes. Simple shapes. And you start with that. Every other detail is just laid on top of those shapes. And you can see where the most important part of the picture is. It's that bright shape there in the middle. You can see the shape of the painting, and that allows you to understand the landscape. It's the same with the Bible. If you start out with the idea that there are simple shapes and everything else is details laid on top, it's easier to understand it. The simple shapes are the covenants that God made with humans. I touched on this on Good Friday, but it kept bubbling in my head, and I realized that I needed to speak on these covenants. The details in the Bible, all those confusing jumble of details, are just laid on top of these covenants. And they show how the covenants work out through humans that are involved with them. Put in literary language, those covenants are the big outline of the Bible. So we're going to look at them today. Going to look at the entire Bible today to see what Paul is telling the Galatians in his letter, because they all know all this stuff. Paul has finished yelling at the Galatians, we're done with that part, for their foolishness, and so now he reviews what he and Barnabas had taught them on their missionary trip. You find it in our text. It's Galatians 3:6 through chapter 4:28. I'm not going to read the whole thing, although the first Sunday that we started Galatians, I did read the entire letter. But if I were to read it now, I wouldn't have to write another sermon. And so I'm not going to read it to you. It's a chunk of scripture to cover in 25 minutes. But we're going to look at all these covenants that are in there. But then I got to wondering, what did Jesus explain to those two disciples on the walk to Emmaus? You remember that story? Jesus had risen from the dead, and these two disciples were on the road walking to Emmaus. We don't know why. It's another town. And Jesus started walking with them. And on that walk, he explained all the way through the scriptures who he was. It couldn't have been a very long walk. I mean, all of that in a day even. What did he tell them? I think he showed them these simple shapes of the Bible, these covenants, and pointed out how he fulfilled each and every one of them with his new covenant. I think that's what he did. But Galatians. Now, when you read it, it sounds like you walked right into the middle of somebody else's conversation. Have you ever done that? Two people are talking, and you walk up to them, and they're in the middle of their conversation, and you don't have any idea what they're talking about. But you start talking anyway, right? No. You don't have any idea. It's like that here. Galatians, to me, is in the middle of a conversation. And Paul has been teaching them. Before that, though, many of them had also been attending synagogue. They were God-fearers, it's called. So they knew the Bible. They knew the Old Testament. And all the stories they'd been taught in the synagogues. So they understood some of this stuff. And so we really are in the middle of a conversation that we know little about. But Paul is obviously writing to people who obviously know so much more about this than we do. Today we're going to do a flyover, as if we had a drone. And we're going to see why he thinks his reasoning with the Galatians should be persuasive. In reading it, you don't really get it yet. You kind of get the gist, but you don't really understand what he's saying. I didn't anyway, until I realized that the whole Bible is bound with a ring of covenants, a golden ring of covenants. And God gave me this image to illustrate that concept. So, here's the big shapes of the Bible. You may not be able to see them in back, but that's okay. This list of covenants, this is the list that Paul refers to in his writings, and you can see them there. These are the big shapes. They are creation, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and Jesus. That's the whole Bible. That's the big shapes. I'll say it again. Creation, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and Jesus. Everything else is detail that's laid on top of those major shapes. So, let's look at the shapes, one at a time. Creation of the earth. God's first covenant was to create a world that was unique in the universe. Apparently, they haven't found anything like this yet, anyway. It's designed so that life can flourish, including humans. So, Paul told Romans in his letter to them that God's beautiful world is an obvious clue to both his power and his existence even. The covenant with Adam was in two parts. There was a blessing, and it was conditional on how he responded. A lot of these are conditional like this. God first told Adam and Eve to multiply and fill the earth, which they were only too happy to do. Humans have been pretty good at obeying that covenant. God also blessed Abraham with a paradise that we call Eden. But he added only one law, just one law. Don't eat from that tree of life. Of course, if you tell a man not to do something, what's he going to want to do? That very thing you tell him not to do, of course. And that's what he did. So, Adam disobeyed about the tree. He ate the fruit and blamed his wife. Sounds about right. She baked it in a pie. How could I know? Well, anyway, they were banished from paradise because he broke just the one law. He had one law, and he broke it. And he took all humanity with him. That's the story of Adam. The next is Noah. You know all these stories. Actually, with Noah, there are two covenants also. One was a repeat of the covenant God had given Adam, which is multiply and fill the earth, and they did that too. And so there was a new start to life on earth. It was like a new creation. But God also gave Noah an unconditional covenant, and they didn't have to obey anything for this one to be true. It was all on God, this one. He covenanted with them not to destroy the earth with a flood ever again. He didn't say anything about fire, though. Did you notice that? Anyway, he put a rainbow in the clouds to be a visual reminder. A reminder of his covenant with the whole earth. So Abraham. This covenant is also in two parts. It's a conditional covenant based on Abraham believing what God had told him. God covenanted with Abraham unconditionally to bless and protect him and his descendants forever. Abraham didn't have to do anything to earn that covenant. He only had to believe it. And he did. He believed God. That's a kind of remarkable thing, though, because none of his relatives and family worshipped this God. So God called just particularly this guy. Interesting. The covenant promised that the whole world would be blessed through God's child of promise to Abraham. His wife Sarah would have a son, and through that son the whole world would be blessed. That was the covenant. But Sarah was old. She couldn't have children, so she didn't believe it. So she gave her maid Hagar to Abraham. And Abraham did have a son by Hagar. But that son was conceived and born by natural means, by biology. Hagar's son Ishmael was not the son that God had promised Abraham. The covenant would not be fulfilled through Ishmael. The child of barren Sarah was to be the miracle child of the covenant. So within Sarah, God created the son of his covenant, Isaac. And so begins the nation of Israel as they see it. But the second part of God's covenant with Abraham was conditional. It's based on a religious ritual. All the males of the family, including the slaves, must be circumcised. He didn't say why, just said do it. But what that is about is this begins the covenant of blood that carries through the rest of the Bible. It's a covenant of blood. That's what Moses' wife told him too. It's the background of this painting, in fact. The painting is of the, the word in the Bible is sarx. Jesus became sarx. The word became sarx, is the way they put it. The word became flesh. It means meat. And so he became muscles and bones and tissue and so on. Covenant of blood. Abraham believed God's promise and obeyed the covenant of circumcision even though he was in his 90s. And that's got to hurt. What a man Abraham. I'd never even thought about that man before. So now we come to the illustration that Paul uses in chapter 4, verse 21 and following. And this is the part I didn't get at all when I was reading this. Hagar's son was not the son of the covenant. We've learned that. Rather, Ishmael would begin a violent, disobedient race of people. Who do you immediately think of? That isn't who Paul's talking about. Paul's not talking about Arabs. We are all kind of conditioned to think of him as that. No, he's talking about rebellious Israel. The children of Hagar. They would persecute the children of the covenant. They would persecute the true Israel who believe and obey God. This is straight from Romans, by the way. They are the true descendants of Isaac, and they include, and this is the part that blew everybody away, they include believing Gentiles. This is the true Israel. That's Paul's illustration. I'm not taking any blame or credit for that, because it sounds a lot like hate speech nowadays, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay, now let's move on to Moses. God's covenant with Moses. And now here is where Paul really diverges from his opponents. The covenant of law is in two parts. It's an if clause. If is big word here. Two little letters mean so much. This covenant with Moses will bring a blessing of unbelievable proportion or cursing of unbelievable suffering. It's conditional on how Israel responds. God's covenant that he would covenanted with them that he would bless and protect Israel and his descendants if they obey him. If Israel keeps the commands, including circumcision and animal sacrifices for the atonement of sin, they will be blessed and protected by God. Now think of this little tiny country surrounded by enemies. God's protecting them. But if they disobey, God will remove his protection. They will be overrun, as they were, over and over and over. You read Judges, and that's what it is, over and over and over and over. And then, you read the Old Testament, it's like the saddest book you ever read, all the way to the end, as this covenant works its way out. Paul reminds the Galatians that this is a conditional covenant of law given through Moses to Israel, and it was meant by God to bless him. It was a remarkable protection against. If you look at the law itself, it's a protection against exploitation of one Israelite over another. And God. It was meant to give them peace in their community and peace with God. That's what it was for. And as much as they insisted they would obey it, they never did. Not completely. They never did do the year of Jubilee, for example. But they added all kinds of other laws to it. I think what they have, 600, 700 laws, something like that. So instead of the great blessing that God intended, the law became a great curse to them. Paul's reminding the Galatians about this curse. Apparently they hadn't heard about it. The law of Moses is not to be obeyed in one part and disobeyed in another part. It's all one thing. You disobey. This is what the Bible teaches. You disobey one part, you've disobeyed the whole thing. You can't say this is the ethical part and this is the ceremonial part, and I can disobey that, but I have to obey this one. You can't do that. It's one piece. And they disobeyed it. And so the curse fell on them. Now Paul reminds the Galatians that putting yourself under that law, which is what they were being taught they should do by these people who followed Paul. You should put yourself under this Jewish law. Paul's reminding them it puts you under the curses that are the flip side of the law. Paul's saying to the Galatians, do you really want to do that? He knows the cursing aspect of the law has been hidden from them. You know when you're advertising something, you don't tell all the bad stuff about your product? You're not going to sell much if you do. Now, let's not talk a whole lot about the curses. Let's just talk about the blessings of the law. And so Paul is now telling them, he's revealing to them, in effect, haven't you read the fine print in the law at all? And the truth of the matter is, in Deuteronomy, it isn't even fine print. It's printed in the same way the blessings are. Didn't you read that at all? So Paul asks, since God's permanent covenant with Abraham was given before this law of Moses, it didn't revoke the blessings of Abraham. The law of Moses didn't revoke what God had promised, this blessing of faith. That's what he's telling him. So why would you want to go back to the covenant of law? It was just added. Don't go back to it. The covenant of that law has the if clause. The law of Moses resulted in the curse, not the blessing God intended for the Jews or anybody else. So Paul tells the Galatians something like this. If you want to have faith in that law, it will curse you, it won't bless you. You won't be able to keep the whole law more than anyone else has been able to do that. And the Jews know that only too well. They're just not telling you. So Galatians 3:21, Paul says, if a law could have been given that would save humanity, God certainly would have created such a law. But by its very nature of law and the nature of humans, there is no law that could save humanity. Just like that one law of Adam. He gave the law, and the law made him want to do it. That's the nature of law. So, next question. Why was the covenant of law given through Moses if all it did is curse people? Was God that mean and hateful? No. God intended the law to bless people, to give them peace in their community. The problem with humanity is what people were doing what was right in their own eyes. This is repeated over and over in the Old Testament. Humanity lived by the rule of the strongest and the greediest. Ayn Rand, she's written whole books about this, advocating this. People destroyed one another. We see that all through history. If people are left to their own devices, they will destroy one another. So God gave the law of Moses to show people what God had planned from the day he made us in Eden. The law tells people how to live in harmony with one another and with God as our loving Father. Paul says the law was like a guardian to keep people from killing each other. You know how kids are. Maybe your mom has said this too. It's all fun and games until someone gets hurt or murdered for nothing. No law from God could change that because it's in the nature of humans. Now, the covenant with King David. This one was unconditional. God just told him he was going to do it. God covenanted with King David that he would make his throne last forever. But the Bible shows that David's line of kings ended. So what happened to the promise? What happened to that covenant? Both Judah and Israel split up. Israel and Judah were both sent into exile. When they came back, it never was the same again. The covenanted promise to David seemed to have failed. But in his letter to Romans, Paul explains that the covenant with David didn't fail. It did not fail. And he explains why. And that brings us then, and you know where this is going, it brings us to the covenant of Jesus. With Jesus, through Jesus. Whatever those words you want to use. I think through Jesus is probably the best word. God's covenant through Jesus. The covenant with King David was fulfilled by Jesus, who was born in the line of David through Mary and declared by God to be Messiah, the Son of God, the King of Israel. That covenant made through Jesus is what Paul taught the Galatians. That's what he taught them. Jesus successfully atoned for all the failings of all those other covenants before him through his own sacrifice of his own flesh and blood on the cross. The new covenant in Jesus' blood atoned for all the sin of human flesh and blood. He atoned for all our sin. This covenant then goes full circle, all the way back to the faith of Abraham. Jesus' new covenant, in his own blood, requires humans to only believe it. Just as Abraham believed God, and God counted it as righteousness. It's the same unconditional covenant God made with Abraham. It leaps over the covenant of Moses to circle back around to Abraham, the father of faith, and the only God there is. As Scripture says, Abraham believed God, so God counted it to him as righteousness. There's the big pictures. There's the big shapes. Only believe in God's sacrifice to atone for your sin. That's it. Only believe. It's quite a low bar, wouldn't you say? You don't have to do anything. You just have to believe it. Paul is saying, in the end of all these covenants, it boils down to one heroic man sacrificing himself to save us all. So Galatians, if you go back to that covenant, that law of Moses, thinking you're going to be saved by it, you will be cursed by it. And God's sacrifice for you can't save you at all. That's what he's telling them. So God's answer was to atone for all those sins of humanity through the death of Jesus. Okay. All right. All that's finished. It's done. Jesus said on the cross, it's finished. And here's the surprising part. The part nobody figured on. Then, to prevent further sin, to keep people from murdering each other and destroying the earth, God himself comes to live within his people. That hadn't been done before. That was the part no one figured out. It says in the Bible that the prophets were looking forward to figuring out how God was going to do this. Nobody figured this out. That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2:9. What eye did not see, nor ear did not hear, and what never entered the human mind, God prepared this for those who love him. What no one figured out was that each believer would be a temple of God himself. It's unbelievable, really. Oops, I used the wrong word, didn't I? It's believable. It's believable. There's no longer any need for law. It says in another place, law is meant for lawbreakers. If you're not a lawbreaker, who needs a law? Each believer knows in his heart what the right thing to do is. And not only that, you want to do what the right thing is to do. A person only has to believe God for God to enter into you when you accept Jesus' new covenant. That's it. So now the new covenant in Jesus' own blood created a people for God. A permanent covenant for a permanent people of God. And there is no need for any other covenants with humans on the earth. Except for one more. The covenant of a new heaven and a new earth. In other words, a new creation. As the writer of Revelation said in Revelation 21:2-5, I also saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. And then I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God is dwelling with humans, and he will live with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And death will no longer exist even. There won't be any grief. There won't be any crying, and pain will no longer exist. And I find that very attractive. Because the previous things in the old creation that got everything all messed up have passed away. It's a new creation. Then the one seated on the throne said, look, I am making everything new. He also said, write this down because these words are faithful. They're true. This is going to happen. As the writer of Hebrews describes in Hebrews 12:22-25, you have come to Mount Zion itself. You have come to the city of the living God, where a myriad of angels are gathered in festive gatherings. You've come to the assembly of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. To God, who is the judge of all. You have come to the righteous people made perfect. To Jesus, the mediator of this new covenant. And to the sprinkled blood, which says something better than the blood of Abel. Make sure you do not reject the one who speaks. Make sure you do not reject the new covenant. That is God's covenant. New covenant. Completed in the atoning flesh and blood of Jesus. And he has been faithful to all his other covenants. He's going to be faithful to accomplish this one too. The circle has been made complete. The circle has been made perfect. We will be like him, for we will see him as he is. That's the... I won't say unbelievable. That's the covenant. We will be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Hang on to that. Hang on to that. The ring of hope for us. The new covenant in Jesus' blood. Amen.